Welcome. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. It's an understatement to say that COVID-19 has upended all of our lives, but it has created a particularly unique set of challenges for parents who've had to manage working from home. Maybe they've lost their jobs, they've had schools close, and then they've had to jump into remote learning with their kids. Today, we're going to discuss the insights from an 8-week long national parent poll that was led by the National Parents Union and conducted by Echelon Insights. We're going to explore how parents feel in the middle of this global pandemic. Are they ready to send their kids back to school in the fall? What do they think schools should do to ensure health and safety of their children this coming fall? And what do they want in the wake of the killing of George Floyd? We're joined today by two amazing leaders. Kristen Solsters Anderson is a pollster, speaker, commentator, and author of The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America. She's also co-founder of Echelon Insights, an opinion research and analytics firm. We're also joined by Carrie Rodriguez, who's the founding president of National Parents Union. It's called arguably the most successful parent organizer in education advocacy today. She has an outstanding commitment to social, economic, and educational equity for children and families that span decades. So we are going to jump in to the substance of what these 8 weeks of parent surveys have told us. But we're going to encourage you to be part of this conversation. And the best way to do that is to think of questions that you want answered during this conversation. The two ways to submit your questions. One is you can email Olivia Shaw at olivia.shaw@aei.org. So olivia.shaw@aei.org. Or you can tweet it with a hashtag pandemic parenting. And we're going to curate your questions and we're going to make sure we fold that in. But from now, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, who's going to jump in on some of the top lines and some of the big takeaways. We're going to go over to Carrie for what some of the parents are saying about education. I'll wrap up with some economic insights, and then we'll go into a Q&A dialogue. So Kristen, thanks so much for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Of course. Thank you so much for including me in this. This survey was an honor to work on and was endlessly fascinating because what made this study unique is that we went into the field not just once, but 8 different times to see how the views of parents changed or didn't change as the COVID-19 crisis unfolded. We know that in countless areas throughout American life and politics, those early weeks and months of the crisis felt like they were unfolding very quickly and lots of change was happening. And we wanted to see how are parents reacting to this? What do they need? What do they think their kids need? And how do they assess how schools are doing with grappling with this rapidly unfolding crisis? And we also, over the course of those 8 weeks, we had some questions that we kept constant so that we could see trend lines move. And we had other questions that were unique week to week so that we could touch on new and emerging issues that popped up as time went on. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to walk you through just some top line findings from the study that I think summarize where parents are feeling about schools and how those sort of feelings evolved over the course of the 8 weeks of our study. We began our study in April, late April, and finished it up around mid-June. Each week, we studied 500 parents of K-12 public school students nationwide. And what we wanted to do was first ask, what are people worried about? There are plenty of things parents can be concerned about during this time. What are the things they're the most worried about? And we pretty consistently found concerns about school closures having a negative effect on children's education, as well as kids missing important social interactions at school. That missing out on being in person in school was both about missing learning the academic skills, as well as those social interactions that teach kids how to interact with one another and thrive socially. But they were also worried about them or someone in their family getting the coronavirus. And consistently through our study, when we would ask parents, how do you think your schools are handling the COVID crisis? They would give them pretty good views. There was an understanding that during this crisis, schools were grappling with an unprecedented situation. Everyone was worried about the coronavirus. And so closing schools, moving to remote learning, for most of these parents seemed like, hey, we're just trying to do the best with what we can. But they did note that their children were feeling things like lonely, anxious, concerned that their children were perhaps not grappling completely perfectly with the situation. It's a hard situation for anyone, especially a child who's being thrown into something unusual. And then parents overwhelmingly say they're feeling anxious, exhausted, frustrated. A majority of parents say they were worried about how the situation affects their own health or mental well-being. They're more worried about how it affects their children, but a majority is still worried about how it's affecting them personally. And in particular, it's parents of young children who are the most likely to say they feel exhausted, that the burden of having to take on what may have previously been handled by school and childcare just proves to be exhausting for many parents who find themselves stuck in an unusual situation as a result of this pandemic. We then wanted to know, what do parents need? And consistently, week to week, we found the top thing parents said that they needed was help keeping their children engaged in good activities. This, again, we found was particularly the case for parents of elementary age children, needing that support and assistance with making sure that their children have something that's keeping them intellectually stimulated and engaged is a big challenge. It was frankly more of an issue for many parents than something like more money to spend on necessities, which frankly I would have assumed would have been at the top of the list. So then when it comes to the question of reopening, if we know that it was tough having schools closed, but that parents in some ways were giving schools a bit of the benefit of the doubt, they were worried about the effects on their kids. But do they think that schools should reopen? We asked this question almost every week of our study and found that on balance, a majority of parents each week said that they felt schools should remain closed until they're certain there is no health risk, even if it means students fall farther behind. I was frankly a little surprised at this result because we made sure to include even if it means students fall farther behind in the question wording. However, you do see that over the course of those 8 weeks, we saw a rise in the number of parents saying, no, you know what, I think schools should reopen as soon as possible so students don't fall too far behind. So this is a number that as we get into the fall will be very interesting to revisit. At what point do parents begin thinking about these trade-offs between the health risk and the downsides of staying home in a different light? We also found that there are big differences on this question by race, that white parents are a little more likely to say schools should reopen as soon as possible, while Black and Latino parents are much more likely, 70% when we combine the results of our weeks 2 through 8, to say that schools should remain closed until there is no health risk. So really placing a significant expectation on schools that you need to reopen, but when you do, there needs to be no risk. You need to be doing whatever you can to minimize that risk. Now, this again, just because they want schools to stay closed until there's no risk does not mean that they think schools staying closed has no consequences. Here we pose the question, which do you agree with more? Are you worried about more? That my children are missing social interactions with friends, that could negatively affect their emotional well-being, versus allowing my children to hang out with friends could put them at risk of being exposed. Week to week, this was sort of an interesting tug of war, initially very slightly leaning toward allowing my children to hang out with friends could put them at risk of being exposed, but then sort of flipping back, a very tough tension for a lot of parents, splitting ultimately effectively down the middle when you combine all of the weeks together. So then when will parents feel safe? Well, when we asked this in mid-June, most parents did not think that they would feel safe sending their children back to school right away. Only 27% said they expected to feel safe doing so in August or September. Another 17% said later in the fall. But that's an awful lot of parents who say they're either not sure or they frankly think it will be winter, spring, or later before they feel safe sending their children back. And this is another issue where we found a pretty big divide between white and non-white parents, with white parents being more likely to say, yep, I'll feel comfortable sending them back in August or September, but with parents from communities of color being much more likely to say, I think it's going to be the spring or later before I feel safe sending my children back. And then finally, on the question of who do they want to hear from on this issue, who would you trust most to establish and evaluate school safety procedures? Politicians fall pretty low on this list. They want to hear from state and local public health officials. They want to hear from the CDC. They want to hear from, if anybody is an elected official, state governors, maybe local district leaders, but whether it's the president, Congress, state legislatures, they're just not interested as much in hearing from them. They want to hear health officials be the ones to carry the message about whether or not and how to reopen schools safely. We then wanted to say, well, are you confident that schools can meet these expectations and can provide what children will need? And the bar is set pretty high for schools because parents at the moment feel like, yes, I think this is going to be able to work. When we asked this question, we had 3 out of 4 parents say that they feel at least somewhat confident that their children's schools will be able to provide what they need academically. A similar proportion, about 70%, say they believe that they are at least somewhat confident that their school will be able to provide resources to support their children's mental health and well-being. And then another 67% say they feel at least somewhat confident that schools will implement recommended health and safety measures. So parents, I think, are looking at this glass half full at the moment, but as schools approach, again, schools are expected to do these things, and if they fall short, I don't think parents will be very forgiving. So then what are their intentions and expectations? Before I hand it over, we find that an awful lot of parents, 21% say that they intend to send their child to a different school or to homeschool next year. It's particularly high among parents who say that their child has some kind of disability, that the existing school system just doesn't seem like it's a good option for them. Of that 21% who said they intend to do something different with their child next year, the plurality of them say they intend to homeschool. Another 20% say it'll be a different public school in a different school district that they'll be sending them to. And 18% say a different public school, but in the same school district. And why? Most of this is around concerns for their health and safety. If you don't feel confident that schools are going to be able to get the health piece right, that seems to be the biggest reason why folks are saying, I think I'm just going to homeschool my children next year or put them into a different situation. So with that, last but not least, 59% do say they plan to send their children to the same school. But we then ask people, if you could do anything, if you had all the resources in the world, if you could send your child to any school next year, which would you prefer? It drops down to only 41% say that they would go to the same school given any option. Homeschool goes up to 18% and private school goes up to 16% if people had the choice to send their children wherever they wanted. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to Carrie to talk through a little bit about what education should look like if and when children get back into these schools.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to start off just by acknowledging how extraordinary this partnership has been. The National Parents Union is an organization of over 200 parent advocacy and activist groups in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. We are parent activists and advocates. We're mamas, we're dads, we're tias, we're abuelitas. We are a group of parents across the country who are very concerned about our kids and have been in this fight for a long time, but have had a lot of trouble actually entering into the conversation because so often parents are reduced to anecdote. Our stories, our firsthand experience. But we knew we could overcome this with data. And so by being able to partner with Kristen and with you, John, and really ask some powerful questions, giving our context and perspective coming together so we could do it in a really smart way and really be able to quantify how parents were feeling. Finally, parents were able to enter this conversation. And I think we did a lot of really important work. So I want to acknowledge the ladies that did extraordinary work in contributing and asking really tough questions and smart questions and bringing the voice of their community so we could actually inform what should these questions be that we are asking families. So it was only through this partnership that we were really able to do something pretty extraordinary to make sure that we were quantifying how parents were feeling. And I think that's what makes this work really special. So what I'm going to be talking about is kind of taking us through, and I apologize, I'm going to start from the very beginning here. What should school look like in a COVID-19 world and beyond? Because as Kristen was saying, parents are struggling right now. They're trying to imagine what it should look like. They're trying to figure out, there's a lot on our plate. But there's one thing that was very clear. When we asked parents, should schools be focused on trying to just return our kids back into the same classrooms, the same systems, the same environments as quickly as possible? Or should they be refocused on rethinking how we should educate students, coming up with new ways to teach our kids and how to move forward with a more innovative approach? It was very, very clear that parents felt by a consistent margin, a 2-to-1 margin, that we need to be reimagining schools. So I thought that that was very consistent, the voice of parents being heard, that they're not interested in having their kids just be shoved into the same old traditional box. And frankly, that was something we were seeing, at the grassroots level, where parents who are unfortunately traditionally very familiar with being underserved, looking at this unprecedented challenge as a moment of opportunity for us to have a different conversation about what schools should look like. But when it comes to that, and we talk about what should reimagining school look like, we wanted to double click on that. What kinds of things are parents thinking about when we talk about reimagination? So we asked them very specific questions, and our leadership group from the National Parents Union had some ideas based on the work that they had been doing in their states, and brought together some interesting perspectives, including offering more opportunities for high school students to participate in work-based learning programs, apprenticeships. Parents are very concerned about the school to career pathways and what does school actually translate into. So we put that in the field, and we tested it. We asked families, and by 86%, families strongly or somewhat supporting offering more of those opportunities, offering more trade and vocational classes in high schools at 84%, providing all students with laptops and tablets and high-speed internet. That was something that was very clear. Our systems are very antiquated, and students and families see that. They'd love to see this as an unprecedented opportunity for us to upgrade all of that equipment. Providing counseling and mental health support for students and staff, also critically important. And having the education funding follow the student to whichever school they or parents choose. This doesn't seem that very controversial. It seems like in education politics, it can get very controversial, but for parents and families, it makes sense that we should have the option to choose the educational setting that fits our child. And we are best positioned to make those choices. Also, offering kids more online classes as an alternative to in-person classes, and we see that show up as well in other portions of the survey, that's having that online capacity being very important. Changing the school calendar to provide more time for academic instruction. We have been holding on to this antiquated school schedule for a long time that doesn't work for families across this country. And 71% of American families telling us very definitively that that should change. Also staggering school schedules so there are fewer students in classrooms, which makes sense in a COVID environment, but also makes sense in a regular environment. All right. One of the other questions we asked and we're very concerned about is whether or not it is possible to establish the right to a quality public education as a civil right. Should we change those laws? Should that be established so that it's actionable and that parents have the power to hold systems account if they don't actually fulfill that right to a quality public education? And not surprising to us, 72% of the public supporting that. It's very clear that all parents of public school students seeing that as a very critical right to make sure that there is equity in public education, and that having quality be a piece of that, very important. All right. So what will it take for us to send our kids back into the classroom? That's really the question of the day. It's certainly a question I'm being asked a lot. And, at this point where we are in late July and early August, parents are really making those decisions on a case-by-case basis. We're seeing a lot of our leadership not really knowing what to do, trying to come up with, the best ways to wrap our kids in plastic. And frankly, a lot of parents aren't sure who to trust. As Kristen established before, we're looking for public health officials to really tell us and give us the guidance. But with an ever-shifting, changing infectious disease, in our society right now, it's really hard to figure it out. But we asked the questions, what would you need to see in order to feel comfortable to send your kid back into a public school building? So there are a number of different things. We actually, a lot of these different components that we tested are the result of a subcommittee in the National Parents Union where we were working on a Bill of Rights. What were our terms that we wanted to present all of our education officials in terms of what we needed to see to feel comfortable to send our kids back? So here's what we asked. How important would it be to you personally to have your child's school do each of these following things. Number one, most important thing, requiring students and staff members who may have been exposed to someone who has been tested positive for COVID-19 to stay home for 14 days before returning to school. 81% of us seeing that is critically important. And it makes sense, but it makes things very, very complicated, because when one student shows up who has been exposed to COVID-19, what does that mean for the entire school environment? Who should be quarantined for that 14 days? This is really something that parents are struggling with right now. But we do think it's very important that parents are empowered with information. Frankly, you know, if one of the school kids or schoolmates in your child's class gets lice or strep throat, we're usually immediately notified with a letter or a phone call telling us that, hey, you've got to keep your kid home or your kid may have been exposed. What happens with COVID-19? We haven't been told whether or not we're going to be notified if a staff member, if an educator or a classmate has been exposed to COVID-19. We want to make it very clear that we want to be notified, and we wanted to be notified pretty quickly. What we're seeing, you know, through our work at the National Parents Union is parents want to be notified that day if possible. But what we can tell through this study is 79% of American families overall want to make sure they have that information. We want to make sure there's a full-time nurse or healthcare worker at school. And we want to make sure that from the very beginning, no matter what is going to happen, if it's going to be a hybrid model, if we're going to start school in person and then see how it goes, or we're going fully online, parents believe that all students should have the technology that they need to start from the very beginning, online, 100% if necessary. That means having one-to-one Chromebooks. That means having access to Wi-Fi or access to a hotspot, so everybody has what they need from the very beginning. Also, face masks has been a very popular question to ask as well. 70% of parents telling us that they want face masks to be provided to students and staff and to be replaced regularly. We're seeing this kind of be another point of tension between school districts and parents, because who is supposed to be responsible for providing those? How often should they be changed? And frankly, if they're not changed, if there are problems, if parents can't afford them, how is this going to be addressed? So really important that we made it clear that that is a priority for parents. Making sure that we're limiting the number of students who are in common areas like hallways, libraries, cafeterias, playgrounds, to maintain social distancing. Very important to parents if we're going to agree to let kids back into school. Continuing breakfast and lunch programs, even when schools are closed. 69% of American families saying that that's important. And making sure, and I think this is going to be a critical piece as well, that we provide an individualized education plan for each student that's based on an assessment of their academic and mental health needs, as well as input from parents and guardians. There's been a lot of talk nowadays about whether or not kids should be assessed when they return to school, and whether or not it might be too difficult or it might cause too much stress on kids to ask them to go through a diagnostic assessment to see whether learning loss has occurred or what additional supports they're going to need. Frankly, we had a feeling that we're going to need those assessments in order to adequately provide our kids what they need and determine how much damage or learning loss has happened. It doesn't make sense to us that, you wouldn't take your kid to a doctor that didn't use a diagnostic test like a thermometer to determine your child's educational health. How can you determine, or their physical health, how can you determine their educational health if you're not using some kind of tool to determine what's happening? And we think it should be comprehensive, because if parents have been in the driver's seat when it comes to facilitating education over the past 5 or 6 months, it's critically important that you get the information we have about our kids so we can work collaboratively to make sure we get what they need. So moving forward, bottom line, what is it going to take for parents to really feel comfortable? What would have to be absolutely necessary for us to feel safe sending our kids back to school? And what would keep you from sending your kids back, meaning you would not send your kid to school without this happening? We asked folks, what's your bottom line? And frankly, around 4 in 10 parents were saying they would not send their kids back to school without a COVID-19 vaccine, that they just did not trust the system to do what they said they were going to do to keep our kids safe. And Kristen mentioned that there are disparities between white families and non-white families. I think we'll probably get into that. It's very clear about folks that have been exposed to systemic racism in the past are probably less likely to trust a system when they say, don't worry, we're going to take care of your kids. So many parents feeling very nervous about whether or not they can trust the education system to actually keep their promises. So none of these were very surprising to us, but the fact that making sure that staff was going to be wearing face masks and that those masks were replaced regularly, that testing for COVID-19 was going to be available in all areas, making sure that there was a full-time nurse or healthcare worker at the school. All of these things critically important to parents if we are going to feel good about sending kids back to school. So as we move forward, again, parents of color are more reluctant to send their children back to school until a huge range of conditions are met. And again, I think that goes to firsthand experience. So their experience compared to white families are going to be a little bit different. And I thought that, Kristen may be able to speak to this later in our discussion around Latino parents in particular being less trusting and being a bit more nervous about conditions going back to school. But making sure that people who had been tested positive to COVID-19 were quarantined. We're seeing an uptick slightly, for non-white families, viewing that being very important to make sure that they are notified and that those folks are quarantined. Testing being available in the area, all of those conditions critically important. So parents, what they think their kids will need in the next year. What are the critical pieces that we think our children are going to be struggling with? What are the things that keep us up at night when we think about learning loss? What are the things we worry about when we think about deficits? And what are kids going to be facing when they actually do get to go back in the classroom? So we asked parents, thinking about how the coronavirus situation may have impacted their schoolwork, where do you think they're going to need additional instruction? And it was very clear that math and English, ELA classes, were of incredible concern to parents. Being able to help their kids through subjects that I think at sometimes are very intimidating to parents, especially that math question. I don't know about you guys, but math still gives me the cold sweats. So the idea of my kids being behind there and me not maybe having the skills to be able to help them makes me pretty nervous. So this was not so surprising, I think, when you take a look at the numbers. But what was surprising, I think, to us as an organization was finding out that about 35% of families didn't think it was going to be a problem, that they've got this. A lot of confidence there. All right. Oh, sorry, this is a little fast for me. It keeps going a little bit quickly as I skip the slides here. All right, non-white families, more likely to say their child may need additional instruction next year. I believe this goes to the confidence issue, but as you can see, when it comes to math, when it comes to ELA, when it comes to history as well, non-white parents expressing, some anxiety around whether or not our children have fallen behind in these particular subjects. What are we looking for in terms of making sure we make contact with school? What does good remote instruction look like for us? Wanted to double click on that question, not just ask how it was going, but what was helpful? What did they see so far? What were the common practices? And what did parents actually want to see moving forward? So emailing assignments, getting laptops and tablets, out to families, and making sure that live online classes were being provided. Those were the most common practices. And frankly, as we'll see in the upcoming slide as well, that's what parents wanted to see. They're happy with getting the email assignments from teachers, but live instruction and having that direct connection with teachers, very, very important. So we're seeing here a lot of commonality in families with, having the emails, making sure that laptops and tablets were available. Again, those live online classes, pre-recorded online classes also being available. But as we move forward, what parents wanted to see increased again were those live online classes with their teachers, and making sure that those were available. I think it's that one-on-one touch or that live interaction with somebody who is not just your mom or dad. They see how their kids light up when they're able to interact with their teachers who they have connections with. So I think, just from the family, from the heart level, that is critically important. One other thing that we did want to highlight in here as well, training and information sessions for parents to help facilitate learning from home. This is a conversation that is not being had enough on the statewide level and frankly on the district level across the country, as being reported by many of our affiliates. In order for remote learning to happen, especially in K-6 education, parents must be equipped with the information on how to actually make this happen. What are the successful tips and tricks? How to get our kids just to sit and not wiggle is job number one, and that can be really difficult. Guidance from teachers, guidance from districts can be very helpful, but we also have to address the digital divide. Many parents are survivors of our own public education experience and our own public education systems that were dysfunctional when we went through the school system. So that digital divide is very real. It can be very difficult for parents to struggle with the technology required to actually help to facilitate remote learning. So even if you're dropping off that Chromebook, even if you're dropping off that hotspot, parents are still turning to their iPhone 7 to try to access the information because they're intimidated by the technology. So providing that training and information, you're seeing 30% of American families really looking for that help. Another important question we had to ask during the course of this survey, when we saw racial uprising happening across the country. Again, the National Parents Union is a collective of 200 organizations, and our governing body, the National Parents Council, is a vibrant collective of 16 extraordinary parent activists, women of color, who were struggling to serve their communities and answer a lot of very tough questions for parents and families in this moment. And knowing the pain that they were feeling, their communities were feeling, they wanted to test to see what we could do in this moment to reimagine schools in a far more intersectional way. Not just talking about delivery options, not just talking about some of the traditional things we talk around in education reform, but if we're having this unprecedented moment where we can talk about societal racism and systemic racism, that systemic racism is not confined just to one system. It is not just confined to the criminal justice system. It infiltrates all of our systems, but especially our education system. So we view this as a transformative moment to have a conversation with parents around how do we reimagine a more equitable system that addresses issues of social injustice. So when we talked with our parents around asking these questions, we wanted to be very thoughtful. And frankly, a lot of these questions coming directly from parent leaders from Minneapolis, Minnesota, from Detroit, Michigan, from Philadelphia, who have been struggling with issues around having police officers in school and what that actually means for the school to prison pipeline for years. So in terms of addressing the issue of the day, the death of George Floyd, racial uprising, Black Lives Matter, systemic racism, and what that means across systems. We wanted to ask parents as to whether or not this was the moment to really have schools think deeply about this, and if so, what should they be thinking about? So we wanted to get very specific on this question too and ask them specifically, what would you have schools change if they should change anything? So what came out, and frankly, I was very excited by the fact that luckily this was across all racial guidelines by an overwhelming margin. requiring training for school administrators, for teachers, for staff on cultural awareness and implicit racial bias, starting to own up to the systemic racism that exists in our systems, educators that are struggling with implicit racial bias, providing that cultural awareness and training that is so lacking in so many of our education systems. White non-Hispanic parents, 69% of them being in alignment with this being a priority, 78% of parents in all other racial groups saying that this is critical. Increasing racial and ethnic diversity of school boards, administrators, teachers, and staff. There has been so much work done on this, but there is so much work that we still must do. Upwards of 80% of our educators are white. And we're seeing, even amongst white families, 58% of them saying that this is critically important to increase the racial and ethnic diversity of all of our school leadership, 74% of non-white parents saying it's important. Also asking the question around school police officers in general being in school. This is a critical issue when it comes to Black and Latino families. It's been a discussion for an entire generation. Why do we have cops in schools? How do white families see it? How do Black and brown families see it? 41% of white non-Hispanic parents saying that they would support the elimination of the use of police officers for disciplinary matters. 60% of non-white parents saying the time has come to end that practice. So again, just doubling down on this, more parents thinking schools should rely less on school police officers in disciplinary situations, and folks really looking for us to provide additional social and emotional supports to address student needs with staff like counselors and psychologists and social workers, instead of creating a school to prison pipeline, addressing trauma head on, being more understanding, and having really a comprehensive approach when it comes to this. Parents of color also far more worried about their children being impacted by racist, discriminatory, or unjust comments or actions. This one makes sense, but it was kind of fascinating to see the percentage of white parents who are also concerned about their children being impacted by racist comments or actions by other students. 63% of Black and brown families very concerned about their children being impacted by racial comments. 55% not knowing who to go to at school to deal with racism or discrimination. If you're having a problem with a white teacher who's at the head of your child's classroom, so often the principal is also white. So parents really at a loss as to who to turn to. Being impacted by discriminatory or unjust police actions at school, 54% of non-white families being concerned about that. All of the results are available at the National Parents Union website, which is www.nationalparentsunion.org. And really just absolutely fascinating results. And it was just such a joy to be able to do this work with Kristen and have her stand with us and explain things to us and help us to ask the hard questions that really empowered parents to have a strong voice in the conversation over the last several months.
Great, Carrie. Thank you so much. I am just going to go over a couple quick slides from some other takeaways that we sort of saw, especially on some of the economic issues. And then really, we're going to have a conversation. Again, if you have questions, use the hashtag pandemic parenting or email Olivia. Olivia said she's not getting any love on email right now. So olivia.shaw@aei.org. Let me just share my screen, just a few quick slides, and then we'll get into it. So we wanted to also track during all this, because obviously the pandemic was impacting parents, but also from an economic sense, like it was disrupting work. Parents were losing income, parents were losing jobs. And so we wanted to know a little bit about just how this was playing out as the course of the pandemic played out over those 8 weeks. One of the questions we had asked was, regard to the current situation, how much do you worry about making ends meet? And here you see just huge differences, which is probably not surprising, but it's just always really powerful to see it in the data that those making less than $50,000 a year, hugely concerned about making ends meet, versus those who make above 50,000 or above 75,000, But you also see this along education attainment lines, meaning if you have a high school degree or less, close to 60% of people who have less than a high school diploma are worried versus someone who has a bachelor's degree versus someone who has a graduate degree. And so again, this is just, we have been seeing this even before COVID, that degrees by not just income boosts, but it also builds a lot of insurance into one's sort of stability there. We also have been tracking, this is so critical for given where we are with the Senate right now and Congress debating the next economic package. We wanted to understand how were parents using the direct cash benefit that the CARES Act gave them in terms of a core direct cash investment for them as adults, and then an additional $500 per child. And what you see is that the vast majority of parents were using this just to make sort of ends meet, basic necessities, paying for utilities, groceries and basic household supplies, mortgage or rent, and that just sort of tracked and increased over the period of the 8 weeks. And that just makes sense because a lot of parents weren't really sure how long this was going to last, and so how to use it for a lot more basic necessities. But really powerful slide, particularly as Congress is debating whether or not there should be another round of this direct cash benefits or not. Throughout both Kristen's presentations and Carrie's, you heard a lot about the digital divide. We asked digital divide questions in a number of different ways. One of the ways was to actually borrow from some survey language that Los Angeles did with their parents. And what you find is that the whole purpose of this slide is just to show how localized parent challenges are. That in Los Angeles, huge challenges with internet, high-speed access, with the assignments being super confusing, that we didn't necessarily see in a general sort of way with all of our parents as part of our national surveys, but you did still see like lots of confusion around assignments, need for different explanations. And again, this is just like data that kind of helps map out that parents' experiences are highly, highly localized to a state and to their school district. We also asked just a number of different questions about high-speed internet access, an issue that, again, Congress is debating. And here, not surprisingly, you find that a lot of low-income parents are the ones who are saying that high-speed internet access would be most helpful to them. Not just because of kids and because of the having online access is the way they get access to education, but also for a lot of parents, this is the way they get access to unemployment benefits. It's the way they get access to job training. It's the way they access a lot of different types of government services and even telemedicine. So high-speed internet has just become such a part of the post-pandemic landscape right now. The good news is that we see huge support for this all across race, political parties, incomes, but also particularly with COVID hardship, that this is just a huge issue in terms of, as Carrie was saying, bridging this digital divide is just going to be fundamental in terms of our response in the weeks and months ahead. And so I am going to stop sharing and really are going to have a great conversation now with Carrie and with Kristen. Kristen, I want to just start with you. I mean, you were doing polling, multiple polls all throughout the week. I mean, I just was curious, like what jumped out, what surprised you the most out of this set of polls with parents?
I think I was surprised by two things. One was that on a whole host of questions, there was very little divide, relatively speaking, between folks of different political persuasions. So I am so accustomed in the polling world these days to look at polls, and the biggest divides on crosstabs are by party, where Republicans and Democrats just seem to be living in alternate universes. And when it comes to COVID, and when it came to what do my children need, this is not a red or blue issue. Now, there are some divides, and I think as the pandemic has unfolded, we've begun to, in many national polls, seen more partisan divides emerge over things like should schools reopen. And it can be a little bit complicated at times to disentangle things like race and party, for instance. You know, the fact that we see white parents so much more eager to go back to school, to what extent is that related at all to the fact that if you did a poll today, Republicans might be more likely to see schools reopen, taking cues from someone like the president. So it can be sometimes a little bit tricky to disentangle these things, but I was quite surprised at how small the partisan divides really were at first, considering how much talk there is about how divided we are as a country. The second thing that I think surprised me was the sort of amount of grace, maybe that's not the right word, the amount of leeway parents were giving schools in our survey,
Yeah.
that they were expressing all of these concerns. They're worried their kids are falling behind. They need all of these resources. They're concerned about a million different things. And yet when you would ask, are you satisfied with how your school is done? They would say, yeah, I'm pretty satisfied. Now, will that persist into the fall? I do not. I think that some of that patience is going to run out by the time we get to the fall. But certainly that was also somewhat surprising to me, was that pretty consistently week to week, parents were saying, look, I'm giving my schools the benefit of the doubt for now.
Yeah. Carrie, what do you make of that in terms of because that was striking too, that parents seem to be, Kristen, I think grace is a good word, that they were very gracious in terms of giving schools the benefit of the doubt. But you also were able to see a ton of things that they want to have as part of reopening schools. What's your take on what parents are going to be thinking now and 6 weeks before schools start?
I think that parents viewed what happened in the spring not as remote education, but emergency education. We were in a state of emergency. Nobody knew it was happening. And you can't really blame the system for screwing up when we're all in the middle of something that's unprecedented. I mean, we're reasonable folks, like we're feeling anxiety. We don't know what's going on. We understand that educators and even the folks that run the system, they're human beings. We're all trying to figure this out together. So I think grace was the right word. And frankly, when I had a lot of questions, when parents had a lot of questions overall, we were told to give everybody grace. Let's have grace for each other. Let's take a deep breath. Just do the best you can. But the problem is June came and report cards came out. And for many of us, that grace was not extended to our children via the report cards. Many of us experienced some kind of harsh grading that was, in reviews of our performance as facilitators of remote education. And so I think that has led to a little bit of tension there. I think the fact that folks just kind of, again, to the extension of grace, just kind of like washed their hands and said, okay, school's over. Good luck with summer. Hopefully you'll get this figured out, parents. Now we're scrambling to kind of figure this out on our own with the hopes that during this period where nothing is happening, or it appears that nothing is happening with, planning or trying to figure things out, that, we're hoping that they're getting their act together. That, we're not going to hear the same excuses from educators that, I'm still trying to figure out Zoom. Well, we're 6 months into this, and so I think overall, the grace period has kind of ended. Parents are hoping that the system has got it together now, and that we'll get into a better place. And Kristen, it does look like we have lost John. So you know what? We know what some of the questions are. We're two capable ladies.
Yes.
Jump in.
I will ask you the question that I think is ideal for you to answer, which comes to us via Olivia. She's posted. I'm not actually sure who submitted this, if it came in via Twitter or via email, but the question is, should school funding for the fall be tied to how well the school utilizes remote learning tools? Should it be tied to anything at all, or should schools receive funding regardless?
Well, I will say, I think during this time period, we have to fund schools regardless, because we really don't have any other option. No one has figured out a uniform system of what remote learning should look like. So there's not even time to kind of tie it in that way. I am concerned though, because when I see the teachers unions rolling out a lot of their demands, some of them are very ridiculous, like not just calling for level funding, but we're talking about increasing funding, saying, well, if we cannot have in-person learning, you have to pay all the in-person teachers and then hire an entirely new cohort of online teachers who are only doing online. So it's like doubling staff, doubling their membership, not asking their membership to maybe conform, maybe enhance their skills, move, make some changes so that they can meet the conditions that we're facing right now. So I don't agree with that. Like if we're talking about doubling up staff and doing some of the ridiculous things that teachers unions are asking for now, I'm not with that. But here in Massachusetts, there's going to be $185 million in federal funding coming in here. I would like to see the assessments that are coming out, hopefully rolling out this fall to assess what the learning loss looks like, tied to what that funding is used for. I don't want to see blank checks. I want to make sure that we know where dollars are going, so we can anticipate what learning needs are going to be, and that accountability continues. This is not a free-for-all. This is not an opportunity to take advantage of these systems and to gouge the taxpayers because we're in an unprecedented crisis. So we're going to have to watch very closely in order to get justice for our kids and make sure that, you know, we're doing this in a responsible way.
The next question we have is, I think, a pretty interesting one. Oh, is this John? Are you joining us by phone?
This is John. I have never had that happen to me, but like we just had this massive storm going over the house and this huge power surge that just knocked off the power. So
yep,
thanks, Kristen, for jumping in.
I'm on like the east side of town, so I'm probably, this will probably be me in like 5 minutes. So if I disappear, you'll know why.
Yeah, I think you could see how the room was getting darker.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Suddenly that cheap light I bought on Amazon is really coming in handy.
Thank goodness.
The next question that's come in for us, John, I'll pose this. Carrie, I want to hear from you first, and then John, I'd be interested in your take on this. Governors and superintendents are racing to have plans for the upcoming academic year. There's a question coming into us. Based on what you've seen in the survey results, what advice would you give them? What's your advice for governors and superintendents who are trying to navigate this tough situation?
I think governors should leave it to the experts. So let's give that advice to governors, because governors are, you know, not always the most well-versed. I think they should leave it to those that they have empowered to do this and not make it political, because that's the problem. A lot of this stuff is getting political. And when things start getting too political, parents stop trusting the system and what we're hearing. Superintendents, number one, you got to understand, like, our kids are going back into classrooms with brand new teachers in a lot of spaces. You know, teachers that don't know our kids, at least in the spring, you know, the teachers who were helping to guide us through that emergency education period knew our kids a little bit, you know, had spent 6 months. I thought one of the lost opportunities was the fact that these educators were not instructed to pick up the phone and give us a call. Tell me what you know about my David. Tell me what you know about my Miles. Help me and guide me through this. Make a 5-minute phone call. I think we would have had a lot less heartache had that happened. So I want to say to superintendents, make sure the phone call, the relationship building piece of this happens, because you're going to have brand new educators that don't know anything about our kids who are frazzled in a whole new world of remote learning. Make sure you're having those relationships facilitated, that they're actually happening, that phone calls are being made, that they're being made in the right languages, that, you know, parents are being empowered to share what we know about our kids so educators can learn from us and we can be a part of the team. But I think it's super, super important that we really prioritize making sure that if we're doing professional development, we're trying to make sure that we're making remote learning worth doing, not concentrating on the best way to wrap our kids in plastic. Because the fact of the matter is these schools are probably going to end up shut down. You're going to get one COVID-19 case, or you're going to get 5 in a school, and you're going to be shut down, and you're going to be doing remote learning anyway. Spend this time to invest and make remote learning worth doing. Work with parents so that we also have professional development to help facilitate this remote learning, and we can help our kids, because you can't do this without us. And work on that relationship piece. It's critically important.
John, how about you? What would you advise governors and superintendents to do based on all of the work that you've done and seen?
Well, I think the biggest insight goes back to Kristen in the early part of your presentation, that parents trust health officials to be the experts to say when it's safe to have kids come back to school. And if there's any mistake that I think I've seen with school district superintendents and with a handful of governors, is that we have too many education leaders and experts that are up there saying now it's safe to come back to school. And what they need, I think, is like every governor and every superintendent needs their Dr. Tony Fauci. Like they need a trusted health expert that is looking out over all the different types of research that is coming out, that is looking at the CDC guidance that can help communicate and the trust that I think parents are looking for, that it's like safe to come back to school. But Kristen, I'd love for you to give some reactions to that question too, just because, I mean, obviously, this is a pandemic that's happening at a moment of a trust crisis with a lot of different types of institutions. And it just strikes me that we're losing parent trust here. And we saw that with the survey, that this was the canary in the coal mine in many ways. The parents were concerned back in June about reopening schools. And it just seems like that concern is growing, not necessarily abating. So is there anything from your sort of research into how to communicate trust and build trust that you think is at play here?
Well, I think what a lot of parents want is to see that states and districts are making a good faith effort to get this right. And that, what we see in our survey data is that while parents were broadly, again, giving school districts grace for, look, it's not going to be perfect, but we're in an emergency situation, is that the experiences were nonetheless really uneven. The types of supports that parents said they were getting were not uniform across the board. So while there may be some parents who said, look, remote learning was great in my district. We had lots of live time with the teacher. We got lots of support, plenty of good activities for our kids. There are other parents out there who are like, you had my 6-year-old on a Zoom call and you sent me a worksheet packet, and that was school. And that I think is what you're going to see parents going, okay, look, that was an emergency situation, but you had all summer. And so what you either need to have is a clear path for how we get these kids back in school in a world where a vaccine does not exist, that is flexible, but that takes into account all of these things parents say need to be in place, and that you've really put in the effort to try to do it. But two, that does not view distance learning as just sort of a stopgap measure, but something that is going to be around for the long haul, given that we know that parents view this as a long haul safety issue, that this is not something that's just going to go away in a month or two. So making real investments and making sure that online learning comes with all of these supports parents say, I think that's what they want to see. I think what can be frustrating for many of these parents, and what I expect if we do surveys in the fall is going to show up correlating with parents who are unhappy, is a sense that districts have thrown up their hands and said, well, we tried to figure it out over the summer, but we couldn't, so we just said we're going to do distance learning for the school year, and that everything will feel thrown together in slapdash. And if it does, I think that is what parents will absolutely not tolerate. If it feels like, hey, we gave you all this time, what have you done with it? I think that's the question parents are going to be asking, and they will trust those who have been putting in the work to come up with those answers.
Kristen, I want to jump in because I think parents are already feeling that, and we're starting to see this emerge. And we're going to ask these questions in the fall, but this emergence of parent innovation, homeschool pods, micro schools, these things that are popping up right now, that is coming up from a sense of needing to step up and lead, seeing the chaos in front of us that we're expected to throw our kids into and saying, nope, that's not going to work for us. So it's going to be fascinating to see how parents take that anxiety and turn it into power, which is something that's fascinating to see popping up right now.
I think that is a great point for us to end on, Carrie. And I love that sense of it. So let's end there. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Kristen. Thanks to everyone. And thanks for all of you being gracious to me dropping off quite suddenly on the video. And Kristen, make sure you batten down the hatches. It's a bad storm. But
yep, the wind is coming. I see it right out the window now.
Appreciate just, again, the insights, and there's just such a valuable set of data that's going to help us better understand parents and frankly, to help hopefully plan for this coming fall. So thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Kristen. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this last hour. And again, if you need the surveys, go to National Parents Union website, and we have it up on the AI website as well. All the crosstabs are on both websites, and it's just a remarkable place for you to do your own analysis and hopefully to get smarter as we try to make our way through COVID. So thanks, everyone.